Wealthy billionaires think money buys respect. Arrogant CEO Julian Vance wanted to humiliate a struggling waitress, speaking flawless Parisian French to mock her poverty. He expected tears. Instead, her brutal, perfect reply stunned every single patron into absolute silence. Money screams, but true power whispers. The dining room of L'Atelier de Céleste, Manhattan's most unapologetically exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant, was a sanctuary of hushed wealth. Here, the air smelled of white truffles, aged mahogany, and the metallic tang of old money. Waiters moved like ghosts across the plush Axminster carpets, carrying silver trays burdened with beluga caviar and bottles of Chateau Margaux that cost more than most people earned in a year. For 24-year-old Sophie Mercer, the restaurant was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield. Sophie stood near the service station, her spine aching and her sensible, non-slip black shoes pinching her swollen toes. She adjusted her pristine white apron, her fingers trembling slightly from exhaustion. In her pocket sat a final notice from Mount Sinai Hospital, a crushing $43,250 bill for her mother's ongoing renal failure treatments. Every single shift, every forced smile, every agonizing hour spent bowing to the ultra-rich was measured against that impossible number. "Posture, Sophie," hissed David, the restaurant's notoriously high-strung floor manager. He was practically vibrating with anxiety, his tablet pressed tightly to his chest. "Table 7 is arriving. VIP, and Marco just threw up in the employee restroom. You have to take them." Sophie's heart sank. Table 7 was the prime real estate of L'Atelier, an elevated semicircular booth bathed in the soft, golden glow of a custom chandelier. "Who is it?" she asked, smoothing back a stray lock of chestnut hair. "Julian Vance," David whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of reverence and sheer terror. "CEO of Vanguard Apex, the venture capital firm that just gutted the Midwest manufacturing sector. He's ruthless, he's impatient, and he tips either 50% or gets you fired. Do not look him directly in the eye unless addressed. Do not interrupt him. Go." Sophie knew the name. Everyone in the financial world, and anyone who read the news, knew Julian Vance. He was 32, a self-made billionaire with a reputation for corporate savagery. He bought legacy companies, stripped them for parts, fired the pensions, and walked away with astronomical profits. But to Sophie, the name carried a much darker, far more personal weight. Before her mother's illness, before the crushing poverty, Sophie had lived a very different life. Her father, Thomas Mercer, had owned a highly respected international logistics firm. They had lived in Paris for 10 years, residing in a beautiful apartment in the 16th arrondissement. But 5 years ago, a predatory hedge fund had targeted her father's company in a brutal, illegal short-selling scheme. The architect of that destruction, Julian Vance. The stress of the bankruptcy had caused her father's fatal heart attack, leaving Sophie and her mother with nothing but debts and shattered memories. Now, the man who had destroyed her family was walking through the brass-trimmed doors of her restaurant. Julian Vance looked exactly like a man who owned the world and was actively looking for a reason to fire the person who handed it to him. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke, charcoal Tom Ford suit that draped perfectly over his athletic frame. On his left wrist gleamed a Vacheron Constantin Traditionnel, a watch worth more than the entire restaurant's weekly overhead. Beside him clung a stunning, statuesque blonde named Penelope, a well-known socialite whose family owned half of the real estate in Tribeca. "Absolutely pathetic," Julian sneered as he handed his vicuña wool overcoat to a trembling hostess. Traffic on Park Avenue was a nightmare. "The city is rotting, Penelope." "I know, darling," Penelope purred, batting her eyelash extensions. "But Celeste always makes it better. The chef promised me he saved a white truffle just for us." Sophie watched from the shadows of the service station, her nails digging into her palms. Her instinct was to rip off her apron, march over to table 7, and scream at him. She wanted to demand justice for her father. She wanted to shatter the serene, arrogant bubble he lived in. But the heavy, crumpled hospital bill in her pocket anchored her to reality. She couldn't afford to be brave. She could only afford to survive. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Sophie picked up a pair of leather-bound menus. She forced her facial muscles into the neutral, pleasant mask of a high-end server. "He doesn't know you," she reminded herself. "To him, you are invisible. You are the help. Just take his order, survive the night, and take home the cash." "Good evening, Mr. Vance, madam," Sophie said, approaching the table with practiced grace. She distributed the menus, pouring ice water into their baccarat crystal goblets with a steady hand. "Welcome to l'Atelier de Celeste. My name is Sophie, and I will be taking care of you tonight. Our chef's special this evening is—" "I didn't ask for a speech," Julian interrupted, not even bothering to look up from his phone. His voice was cold, flat, and dripping with disdain. "Bring us a bottle of the 2009 Louis Roederer Cristal, the real one, not the swill you keep up front for the tourists. And bring some gougères, warm, not hot." "Right away, sir," Sophie said, her voice perfectly even. She turned and walked away, her blood simmering. 10 minutes later, she returned with the champagne, presenting the bottle and executing a flawless, silent uncorking. She poured a tasting measure for Julian. He finally looked up from his phone, his cold, slate-grey eyes locking onto Sophie. He didn't look at her face. He looked at her uniform. He took in the slightly frayed cuff of her sleeve, the cheap, non-slip shoes, the lack of jewellery. A cruel, amused smirk played on his lips. He took a sip of the champagne, swished it around his mouth, and swallowed. "Adequate," he muttered. He leaned back in his leather booth, wrapping an arm around Penelope. "You know, Penelope," he said loudly, making sure Sophie could hear every word. "The problem with this country is the service class. They have no refinement, no culture. They are entirely uneducated. You can put them in a nice uniform, but underneath, they're just peasants desperate for a handout." Sophie stood frozen, the heavy champagne bottle cold against her palm. She bit the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. "Don't react," she screamed internally. "Think of the dialysis. Think of Mom." "Oh, Julian, don't be so mean," Penelope giggled, lightly slapping his chest. "I'm sure she tries her best." "Trying isn't enough," Julian replied smoothly. He looked directly at Sophie, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "Let's have some fun, shall we? Let's see just how uncultured our little waitress really is." Julian Vance leaned forward, interlacing his manicured fingers on the stark white linen tablecloth. He had built his empire by identifying weaknesses and exploiting them mercilessly. Tonight he was bored, and Sophie was the nearest, easiest target. He decided to use a weapon she couldn't possibly defend against: language. "You see, Penelope," Julian said, his voice dropping into a smooth, theatrical baritone. "True luxury isn't just about paying for food. It's about being understood. Let's order in the language of gastronomy. If she can't comprehend, we'll have David fire her and fetch us a real server." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. No, he wouldn't. Julian turned to Sophie, a predatory smile stretching across his face. When he spoke, it was no longer in English. He switched to French. It wasn't the slow, clumsy French of a high school classroom. It was rapid, highly idiomatic, upper-crust Parisian French, laced with complex culinary vocabulary. "Écoute-moi bien, ma petite," Julian began, his tone dripping with patronizing venom. "Listen to me well, little girl. Je veux le turbo sauvage, mais pas cuit de manière classique. Je l'exige poché dans un bouillon de coquillage infusé au safran d'Iran, avec une julienne de légumes oubliés glacés au beurre truffé. I want the wild turbot, but not cooked in the classic manner. I demand it poached in a shellfish broth, infused with Iranian saffron, with a julienne of forgotten vegetables, glazed in truffled butter." He paused, watching Sophie's face intently for a sign of panic, for the inevitable widening of the eyes and the stuttering apology. Sophie stood perfectly still. Her face remained a placid mask of professional courtesy. Inside, however, a storm of memories was crashing over her. She was 7 years old, running through the Luxembourg Gardens. She was 12, sitting at the massive oak dining table in their Paris apartment, listening to her father debate European trade policies with visiting diplomats in flawless, rapid-fire French. She was 16, reading Marcel Proust in the original text, guided by her private tutor from the Sorbonne. French wasn't just a language to Sophie. It was the soundtrack of the life Julian Vance had stolen from her. Julian, mistaking her silence for ignorant confusion, let out a short, cruel laugh. He turned to Penelope, continuing in French, so his date wouldn't understand the sheer brutality of his words. "Regarde-la, Penelope. C'est pathétique," Julian scoffed, his voice carrying clearly over the soft jazz playing in the background. "Look at her, Penelope. It's pathetic. Elle me fixe avec les yeux vides d'une vache qui regarde passer un train. Ces gens de la classe ouvrière sont comme des machines biologiques. Pas de cerveau, juste de la sueur et de la stupidité. Elle n'a aucune idée de ce que je dis. Je pourrais l'insulter, insulter sa famille misérable, et elle continuerait à sourire pour un pourboire de $20. She stares at me with the empty eyes of a cow watching a train go by. These working-class people are like biological machines. No brains, just sweat and stupidity. She has no idea what I'm saying. I could insult her miserable family, and she would just keep smiling for a $20 tip." A nearby couple at table 9, an elderly French banker and his wife, gasped softly, having overheard the vile tirade. They looked at Julian with profound disgust, then cast pitying glances at Sophie. The tension in the immediate vicinity of table 7 became suffocating. Manager David, sensing a disturbance from across the room, began power-walking toward them, his face pale. "What did you order, baby?" Penelope asked, oblivious to the horrific insults, purely enchanted by the romantic sound of the language. It sounded so sexy. "Just a specialized fish dish, darling," Julian smirked in English. "But I think we're going to need a translator, or perhaps a dog whistle." He snapped his fingers right in front of Sophie's face. "Snap out of it, sweetheart," he barked in English. "Did your brain short-circuit? Go get your manager. Tell him you're entirely unequipped to serve people of our caliber. Run along now." Sophie didn't move. She looked at the man who had bankrupted her father. She looked at his expensive watch, paid for by the destroyed livelihoods of thousands. She felt the hospital bill burning like a hot coal against her thigh. For 5 years she had swallowed her pride. She had bowed, scraped, apologized, and suffered in silence to keep her mother alive. But right here, in this moment, under the blinding crystal lights of L'Atelier de Céleste, Julian Vance had crossed a line that money could not protect him from. He had not just insulted her poverty. He had insulted the memory of her father and the heritage he had bestowed upon her. Sophie slowly closed her leather-bound notepad. The soft click of the cover shutting sounded unnaturally loud over the sudden quiet of the nearby tables. She slipped her pen into her apron pocket. She took a half step closer to the table, her posture shifting perfectly from the deferential slump of a tired waitress to the ramrod straight, aristocratic bearing of a diplomat's daughter. When she finally looked Julian Vance directly in the eyes, there was no fear, no subservience, and no tears. There was only absolute, terrifying authority. The trap was set. Julian thought he was the hunter playing with his food. He was about to find out, in front of the entire elite dining room, that he had just walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. Sophie opened her mouth, and what she unleashed next would become a legend whispered in Manhattan's high society for years to come. The dining room remained wrapped in its quiet hum of clinking silver and low jazz, completely unaware of the detonation that was about to occur at table 7. Sophie looked down at Julian Vance. Her posture was flawless, her chin tilted at the precise, imperious angle favored by the Parisian elite. When she finally spoke, her voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp clarity that sliced clean through the ambient noise. "C'est une tragédie, Monsieur Vance," Sophie began, her accent an immaculate, honeyed echo of the 16th arrondissement, entirely devoid of hesitation. "It is a tragedy, Mr. Vance. Que tout l'argent de votre fonds d'investissement ne puisse pas vous acheter une once de raffinement ou un palais décent, that all the money in your investment fund cannot buy you an ounce of refinement or a decent palate." Julian's smug smile instantly froze. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen grey. His eyes darted up to her, wide with sudden, uncomprehending shock. Sophie didn't stop. She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a chilling register of absolute authority. "Le turbot est un poisson délicat. L'étouffer dans un bouillon de fruits de mer safranés et le recouvrir ensuite de beurre truffé n'est pas de la haute gastronomie. C'est une abomination culinaire. C'est le genre d'erreur tape à l'œil que fait un parvenu de la nouvelle richesse quand il essaie désespérément de prouver qu'il a de l'importance. Turbot is a delicate fish. To smother it in a saffron seafood broth and then cover it in truffled butter is not haute cuisine. It is a culinary abomination. It is the kind of flashy, nouveau riche mistake a parvenu makes when he is desperately trying to prove he matters." Penelope, sensing the abrupt and drastic shift in the atmosphere, stopped playing with her napkin. "Julian, what is she saying? Is there a problem with the fish?" Sophie shifted her gaze to the socialite, her expression softening into a mask of pity. She seamlessly switched back to flawless English. "There is no problem with the fish, madam," Sophie said pleasantly. "I was simply informing Mr. Vance that combining Iranian saffron and truffled butter is a catastrophic clash of flavor profiles that will ruin a $200 fillet of wild turbot. I was also explaining that his attempt to humiliate me in a language he barely commands was as tasteless as his dinner order." A sharp, collective gasp echoed from the adjacent tables. The elderly French banker at table 9 actually set down his wine glass, leaning in with undisguised fascination. "How dare you?" Julian hissed, finding his voice. His hands were shaking slightly, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. The veneer of the cool, untouchable billionaire was cracking, revealing the deeply insecure bully beneath. "You insolent little—" "I understood every single word you said, Julian," Sophie interrupted, dropping the Mr. Vance entirely. Her voice rang like struck crystal. "You called me a biological machine. You mocked my family. You assumed that because I wear this apron, I am somehow less human than you, less intelligent than you. But the truth is, I am simply less fortunate." "David!" Julian roared, abandoning all pretense of volume control. Several diners jumped in their seats. "Get the manager over here right now. You are done. You are finished in this city." David, who had been hovering near the kitchen doors, practically sprinted across the dining room. He arrived at table 7, breathless and pale, sweating through his designer suit. "Mr. Vance, I am so deeply sorry. Is there a problem?" "The problem," Julian spat, pointing a trembling finger at Sophie, "is that this wretched girl just insulted me in front of my fiancé and the entire restaurant. I want her fired immediately. I want her escorted out by security, or I am calling my friends at the New York Times dining section and having this establishment stripped of its Michelin stars by morning." "Sophie," David gasped, turning to her with a look of absolute panic. "What have you done? Apologize at once." "She has nothing to apologize for." The voice did not belong to Sophie, nor did it belong to David. It came from table 9. The elderly French gentleman slowly rose to his feet. He was dressed immaculately in a navy blue Brioni suit, his silver hair impeccably styled. He approached table 7 with the slow, measured confidence of a man who moved markets with a whisper. Julian turned, ready to unleash his fury on the interrupter, but the words died in his throat. His jaw actually dropped. Mr. Laurent," Julian stammered, his arrogance vanishing in a millisecond, replaced by the desperate, fawning terror of a subordinate. Sophie recognized the man instantly, though she hadn't realized it until now. Jean-Pierre Laurent. He was a senior managing director at Lazard Frères, one of the most powerful financial advisory firms on the planet, and a primary gatekeeper for the luxury conglomerate Kering. "Good evening, Julian," Jean-Pierre said, his voice quiet, but carrying the heavy, crushing weight of immense power. He did not look at Julian. He looked directly at Sophie. "I couldn't help but overhear your impeccable accent, my dear," Jean-Pierre said gently, switching to French. "Vous avez étudié à Paris?" "You studied in Paris?" "J'y ai grandi, monsieur," Sophie replied respectfully, her posture relaxing slightly. "I grew up there, sir. Mon père s'appelait Thomas Mercer. My father was Thomas Mercer." Jean-Pierre's eyes widened slightly, a flash of genuine sorrow crossing his weathered features. "Thomas Mercer of Mercer Logistics? Mon Dieu. He was a brilliant man, a man of immense integrity. We played chess at the Jockey Club. I was devastated to hear of his passing and the circumstances of his company's liquidation." "Thank you, sir," Sophie whispered, a single tear finally escaping her eye. Not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming validation of her father's memory. Jean-Pierre slowly turned his gaze back to Julian Vance. The elderly financier's eyes were completely devoid of warmth. They were the eyes of an apex predator, looking at a very small, very loud rat. "Mr. Laurent," Julian tried again, his voice cracking. He stood up, desperately trying to salvage the situation. "I had no idea you were dining here tonight. I was meaning to call your office tomorrow regarding the Kering subsidiary acquisition. Vanguard Apex is fully prepared to offer—" "You will offer nothing, Julian," Jean-Pierre said smoothly, cutting him off. The silence in the restaurant was now absolute. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving. Julian blinked, swallowing hard. I don't understand." "Let me clarify it for you then," Jean-Pierre replied, stepping closer so that he was looking down at the younger CEO. "For 3 months, you have been courting my firm. You want us to facilitate your buyout of a European legacy brand. You sold us a narrative of your refined leadership, your global vision, and your respect for European heritage." Jean-Pierre gestured gracefully toward Sophie. "And yet, I sit here tonight and watch you mercilessly abuse a young woman who possesses more class, intelligence, and grace in her little finger than you possess in your entire corporate empire. I listen to you butcher my native language to mock the working class. I watch you insult the daughter of Thomas Mercer, a man whose company you cannibalized to build your pathetic, newly minted fortune. Julian looked as though he were going to be sick. Penelope had shrunk back into the leather booth, looking at Julian with sudden, dawning disgust. "Mr. Laurent, please, this is a misunderstanding. She is just a waitress." "She is a Mercer," Jean-Pierre snapped, his voice finally rising, echoing off the mahogany walls. "And you, Julian, are a thug in an expensive suit. You mistake cruelty for strength, and a bank balance for nobility. Lazard Frères does not do business with thugs." Julian stood completely frozen, the reality of the moment crashing down upon him. The multi-billion-dollar deal, the acquisition that was supposed to secure Vanguard Apex's place in the international big leagues, the deal he had spent millions prepping for, was evaporating before his eyes over a bottle of champagne and a cruel joke. "Our meeting tomorrow is cancelled," Jean-Pierre stated coldly. "Do not contact my office again. If you attempt to launch a hostile bid, I will personally ensure that every major European bank blacklists Vanguard Apex. Are we understood?" Julian could not speak. He gave a single jerky nod, utterly humiliated. Jean-Pierre turned away from the shattered CEO and looked at David, the floor manager, who was shaking like a leaf. "David, is it?" Jean-Pierre asked. "Yes, Mr. Laurent," David stammered. "Bring the check for table 7. Mr. Vance and his guest are leaving. And do not bring them the Louis Roederer. They do not deserve it." Jean-Pierre then turned back to Sophie. The coldness vanished, replaced by a warm, grandfatherly smile. "Mademoiselle Mercer," he said gently, "it is a crime that a mind like yours, and a linguistic talent like yours, is being wasted carrying plates for men who are entirely unworthy of your service. I run the North American division of Lazard. I am in desperate need of an executive liaison who understands both European markets and the reality of hard work. I want you in my office at Rockefeller Center tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning. We will discuss a starting salary, and we will arrange an immediate corporate advance to clear whatever debts your family was left with." Sophie stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. The heavy, crushing weight of the $43,250 hospital bill in her pocket suddenly felt weightless. The years of exhaustion, the degrading shifts, the constant fear of losing her mother, it was all evaporating in the span of a single conversation. "Mr. Laurent," Sophie choked out, her professional mask finally breaking into an expression of profound, overwhelming gratitude. I don't know what to say. Thank you so much." "Do not thank me, Sophie," Jean-Pierre smiled. "Thank your father. He raised a fierce, brilliant daughter." Jean-Pierre gave her a slight bow, turned, and walked back to his table, his wife reaching out to squeeze his hand proudly. Sophie stood by table 7 for one final moment. Julian Vance had collapsed back into his seat, his head in his hands, his career trajectory permanently altered. Penelope was already gathering her purse, refusing to look at him, her social survival instincts telling her to distance herself from a sinking ship. Slowly, deliberately, Sophie reached behind her back. She untied the strings of her pristine white apron. She pulled it over her head and let it drop directly onto the center of the table, right on top of Julian's silverware and baccarat crystal goblet. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Sophie turned on her heel and walked through the hushed dining room, her head held high. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't walking toward the kitchen. She pushed through the heavy brass-trimmed doors of L'Atelier de Céleste, stepping out into the cool, chaotic air of Manhattan, leaving the ghosts of her past behind, ready to reclaim the life that had always belonged to her. If you loved this story of karma and ultimate revenge, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs a reminder that true class can never be bought. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more incredible daily audio stories of drama, twists, and real-world justice. Drop a comment below. What would you have said to the arrogant CEO?